As we've been doing a series of videos addressing some of the common arguments against Christianity from just popular atheist perspectives, I'm going to be dealing today with an argument that comes from Richard Dawkins' book, The God Delusion. Very popular book, came out in 2006 now, so just over 10 years ago, but I still encounter people, particularly kind of teenagers or people who are getting into college, those who aren't really well versed in philosophy and things like that, that maybe were raised in the Christian faith, didn't really know much about it, read Dawkins' book, and were somehow convinced. But I want to interact with the primary argument of that book, which is the Boeing 747 argument that shows up in that text. And I think when you look at this argument, it's really, really philosophically just incoherent and completely irrelevant. Because when we look at the argument, really it's trying to disprove a form of theism which is completely incompatible with Christianity anyway, and not even just Christianity, but most of the classical theistic traditions. So let's get into what the argument is that Dawkins makes here. Now, he frames the argument from something said by Fred Hoyle, which is that the improbability of complex life just developing by mere chance is the same kind of improbability as a tornado going through a junkyard and just putting together a Boeing 747 just by chance. And so Dawkins seeks to take that argument, the argument from a form of the argument from design, and the improbability of chance just creating complex life, and he tries to use that then as an argument against the existence of God, for the improbability of the existence of God. So what does he do with that argument? Well, he takes that argument and says this, that God is the ultimate Boeing 747. And so he says that, well, you're saying that it's improbable that life could exist, that anything could just randomly happen by chance. Now, Dawkins is going to fight against that to say, well, it's not really chance, it's the guided process of evolution. But he's going to say that if you throw that on God, then that just pulls back the question even more. Because what you're saying then is that God is really the ultimate complex thing. And so something so complex, again, still requires complete random chance for it to exist. Therefore, if that's the case, then the existence of God is very much improbable, even more improbable than the existence of the world itself, because God is so much more complex than everything else that exists. Now, when reading this argument, sure, it might seem convincing at first, I suppose, for some, but if you have any grounding in classical Christian theology or classical theistic philosophy of any kind, you would know that the argument is actually completely irrelevant. And the reason why the argument is irrelevant is because the definition of God is completely false, and not a definition of God that you're going to find in classical Christianity, and that is that God is a complex being. Christianity has stated from the beginning, really, and this goes back to some of the classical philosophical traditions as well, in Plato and Aristotle, that God is not actually a complex being at all. And so he's already defining God in a way that simply doesn't make sense. So the way that he's defined God as complex, really, which is the foundation of his whole argument, shows that that's kind of irrelevant. If God is not actually complex, then it's not disproving anything that Christians are actually saying. So God is a simple being. In fact, God is the most simple being. And you have to realize what we mean by that, and that is that God is not composed of parts in the way that humans are composed of parts, in the way that those things within the broader universe are composed of parts. Because if God was composed of parts, those parts would be the most basic element of reality itself. So say God were made of a bunch of atoms. That means that the ultimate basis of all reality is still not God, because the ultimate basis of reality is the atom, because the atom is what makes up God. Think of the old atomists and groups like that. So theists have classically said that God is actually the most basic being, meaning that he is not composed of anything. Everything in God is identical with God himself. And so there is no difference between God's essence and his attributes and those kinds of things that we have as complex beings, created beings. So his argument contends that God is the most complex thing, and instead, through biological evolution, we have simplicity becoming complexity. And really, in classical Christian theism, God is an absolutely simple being, not a complex being. And so what he's arguing is simply irrelevant to a definition of God that any philosophically informed person would recognize. So Dawkins really isn't even in the conversation at all philosophically. Whether Christian or atheist, he's kind of written himself out of the conversation in any real sense because he doesn't even understand and grasp the basic concepts of who God is in any classic theistic tradition. And the other problem is that he just kind of assumes, oh, God is a complex physical being just like everything else. And so God exists within this closed system. And he's assuming first that there is a closed system and God is just another being within it, instead of the fact that God is outside of the scientific system altogether, that he is not a physical being, he is a spiritual being, and that he is the very ground of being and everything that exists itself. So he's defining him within the scientific system and saying that God has to be consistent with these other scientific laws, which again is actually completely irrelevant to classical definitions of God. And in a way, Dawkins doesn't even really address the issue because he says, he's basically setting up two alternatives, which makes more sense of complexity, either a complex being that already just exists within the universe, or a biological process of evolution. Now, he's not really addressing the basic issue there, whether you throw out an idea of multiverses, whether you throw out the idea that there are billions and billions and billions and billions of years, because that the longer period of time that you put out there, the more chance there is of things coming together. Whether evolution is true or not is really irrelevant to the question of God's existence in the first place. Because the question is, why is there something rather than nothing at all? Why does anything exist whatsoever? Because evolution, all you're doing is just pushing the question back so that there's some kind of primordial something that then evolves and becomes complexity. And it doesn't matter if you say, well, there are a bunch of multiverses and it solves the issues of chance or whatever. None of that really is relevant, because none of that is actually answering the fundamental basic question, which is, why is there something rather than nothing? And if you have simply the physical universe and laws that just exist for no reason whatsoever, those are finite contingent things. And the question then is, how can finite contingent things just exist? And it doesn't do to just push the question back and say, well, if you say God had to create, then who created God? Because part of the very definition of God is that there is something that underlies all of existence itself that is not contingent, something that is self-existent in the basis for all of reality itself. So it's part of the very definition of God that he is self-existent. So it's kind of, you can't just throw back that question and say, oh, well, who created God? Because to do that is assuming that God is just some kind of complex object like everything else that exists, instead of understanding that God is the thing that is a se. God is the primary cause of all things. God is the thing that underlies all being and existence whatsoever. And so to say that God exists is to say that there is a transcendental foundation of everything else. And so that question is not even addressed by Dawkins' argument. So the argument for the Boeing 747, the ultimate Boeing, is really just philosophically incoherent and completely irrelevant to classical Christian theology or classical theistic philosophy of all different forms. And so Richard Dawkins is really a biologist. He should stick to biology. And when he gets into philosophical questions, he's really addressing them in a way which are just demonstrate that he is not informed on these issues. And I think if you look at some of the older atheistic philosophers, Bertrand Russell and some others, you'll see that at least these guys knew what they were talking about. And of course, I would disagree with their conclusions. But when you get to someone like Dawkins, he's not even really in the game because his questions are so irrelevant to the actual discussions that philosophers and theologians have been having for centuries.